part of the why of why you might want to do something, has to do with the type of resource base that you have. And we're going to a little bit later on get into specifics of diet selection of cattle versus sheep versus goats, and actually bison and elk in there also. But generally speaking, now I have a picture of cattle in this brush here. And cattle do browse a little bit. They can trample some brush down, but they don't, make near the impact that goats would do. Sheep tend to eat more broadleaf plants than they do grass. And so if you have a lot of broadleaf weed incursion, adding sheep into a cattle operation can utilize more of the plants that are out there. So that's part of why we get into multi-species grazing is we are trying to address some vegetation issues or opportunities that we might have on our property. There is a climatic question, and we'll get into this. Within sheep, we have wool breeds of sheep, we have hair sheep. They have different climatic adaptations and, some other characteristics that are different. Type of cattle, the Scottish Highland cattle, the hairy coos, they're very beautiful animals. And believe it or not, in some evaluations of meat quality around the world, Scottish Highland cattle rank very, very high in terms of meat quality. But South Central Kansas is probably not a place where you want to raise Scottish Highlanders. So there's those kind of considerations. Then there's the markets. Just to illustrate the value of some products regionally. So Idaho is classified as being part of the Pacific Northwest. So I actually live in the Pacific Northwest region, which would include Washington, Oregon, Idaho, and climatically you would roll Northern California in there also. Grass-fed or pasture-finished lamb, pasture-raised lamb, on average sells about 50% higher price per pound than does grass-fed beef. A lot of grass-fed beef producers, struggle to sell all of their products. A lot of the sheep producers I know in the Pacific Northwest have their entire lamb crop sold before the first lamb is born in the spring. That's how high the demand and how high the value of pasture-raised lamb is in the Pacific Northwest. Up in New England, it's kind of similar to that. What do you think the value of grass-fed lamb in South Dakota is? You can hardly give it away. And so that's why I say know what your markets are. Depending on where you are in the country, some of these alternative livestock have a lot better market opportunities than others. Excuse me. Mary was telling me that earlier this summer, they were putting on a goat program. And didn't you tell me that you had to actually schedule another one, have two courses?
Divided the group into two groups. We had 90 people there. Yeah. We were expecting 40.
Yeah, there was so much interest in goats. And we used to think of goats as being a very specialty market, either for the Caribbean population, different cities in the country, or for Muslims. And I don't know if any of you in here eat goat, but properly raised goat and, killed at the proper age, man, it is a very, very tasty meat. And then there's old goat. And old goat is something you got to be a little sick of the head, to want to eat that. And so, what are the market opportunities for these different things? I I can sell a lot of people on the idea of grass-fed lamb based on what the pricing and productivity in the Pacific Northwest is. But if you are not in an area where, an area, I mean, you can ship meat anywhere now. But if within 100 miles of you, there is not a viable population that wants to eat that product, you should probably consider doing something different. All right. And then what about your lifestyle? You know, some people are sheep people, some people are goat people, some people are cattle people. And, you know, you probably don't want to take on a livestock enterprise. I mean, all your analytics says, oh, this will be a good opportunity. You will be selling this for this much. Your gross margin will be here. Your net return is going to be this. If you hate that particular animal, the money won't make it worth it. So you gotta know what your objectives are and then figure out what's the appropriate classes, species of livestock to get you to where you can meet those objectives. So here's, we're going to go through a series of these slides, and it all starts with environmental adaptation. And to me, when we think about genetic selection, the first most important genetic aspect of livestock is, can they live where you live? Because if they can't live cost effectively, they're not going to be worth having. So within cattle, you know, we have two broad types of cattle. The Bos Taurus, which is your British and continental breeds, and as the name implies, these are mostly European developed cattle, excuse me, adapted to the cooler to temperate regions. Angus, Hereford, Charolais, Gelbvieh, Simmental, Devons, those are all examples of British and continental breeds. And they have the environmental adaptation to winter conditions. Most of those breeds do just fine going through the winter. Some of the gee whiz numbers, you know, that will throw out. There is a temperature range at which we are comfortable, and that's called the thermoneutral zone. It is the temperature range in which an animal can exist and not change its metabolism, either because it's too cold or because it's too hot. On British breed cattle, the lower end of the thermal neutral zone, if they have a dry haircut, is 18 degrees Fahrenheit. And so they do not, if their hair coat is dry, it's got to be something under 18 degrees before they notice it's cold. British and continental breeds, you know, some of the continental breeds are a little higher than that, but basically all the British breeds, 18 degrees plus. If the hair coat is wet, for different breeds, you'll see, you know, figures from 32 to about 40 degrees Fahrenheit. In a wet hair coat, they have to adjust their metabolism to accommodate that cold. 70, some of the, coming back to the Scottish Highland cattle, 74 degrees is the upper limit of their thermoneutral zone. So anything above 74 degrees, they are beginning to feel the effects of heat stress. Red hided cattle are more heat tolerant than black cattle. If we look at red Angus and black Angus, we think that, metabolically, well, they're going to be the same. The only thing that's different is they have a different color hide. Well, that different colored hide changes how metabolically they respond to temperature stress. So those are considerations that come in. Now, if we take Bos indicus, so these would be the Brahman, the other Zebu cattle, Nelore from Africa. Kind of lump them together and say the eared cattle. the perspective is it's, all of these cattle have long ears. That isn't necessarily accurate. Most of them do, but not all. Lower into the thermoneutral zone, dry hair coat on most Bos indicus cattle is somewhere in the mid to upper 40s. With a wet hair coat, they can be feeling temperature stress in terms of cold at 55 degrees Fahrenheit. Does it, if you live in northern Minnesota, should you have Brahman cross cattle? Probably not. If you live in South Texas, should you have Black Angus cattle? Probably not, but a whole lot of folks do. And it costs them a lot more money in terms of lost cows who don't breed, lost productivity. Having black cattle in South Texas, I should say Black Angus cattle in South Texas, is a very expensive process or prospect. So these are, some of the very basic things. Now, this area where through Kansas, Missouri, southern Iowa, it's what we call a transition zone. And you can raise either types of these cattle in this zone. And so it becomes something other than just climatic adaptation, what you choose to raise. When we were in Missouri, our cattle were all at a minimum 3/8 Barzone. We ran pretty much 7/8 to 3/8 Barzona cattle. So Barzona is one of the early composite breeds, and they started. I gotta remember this now. All right, so they started with Hereford cattle, which is Bos taurus, bred them to Afrikaner, which is a small-eared Bos indicus. So it started with a hybrid between Bos taurus and Bos indicus. And then those females were bred Santa Gertrudis, which is a Brahman shorthorn cross. So the Barzonas had a dark red hide, which helped their heat tolerance. They were, a percentage Bos indicus, a percentage Bos taurus, and they were quite well adapted through this region. When we first started raising Barzonas in the mid 1980s, we took a hit at the sale barn because they were eared cattle. The last several calf crops that we sold, which would have been in the very late 1990s and early 2000s, our steer calves were usually $2 below the black cattle. Our heifers were usually $2 to $4 above the black cattle, because people were beginning to understand what functional females were, this type of crossbred cattle, very functional females. So we got a premium for heifers, but we still, took a penalty for the steers, but we could raise those cattle very, very, very cheaply. So you thought we were going to talk about multi-species, and here I am stuck on the dang cattle again. All right. So within the sheep, as I said, we have wool breeds and we have hair breeds. We had sheep for 9 years that we were in Missouri, and they were wool breeds. As a matter of fact, I had about 60 white commercial ewes, and then Dawn had 40 colored long wool breeds for hand spinning and weaving and stuff like that. Then she had a fleece and fiber business. Hair sheep weren't a big thing at all, back in the 1980s and early 90s. And so wool breeds is what we did. And there's a lot of variance in heat tolerance across those wool breeds. So that has to be a consideration. Now, most people who are raising sheep are raising hair sheep. At the time when we got out of the sheep business in 1993, paying the shearer cost more than the value of the wool. When we first started in sheep in 1980, the historic perspective was you paid the shearer, and then you always had a bonus check for the wool after that. And some people said the wool crop would pay the entire feed cost of the ewe for a year. I don't know if that was true, but that's what tradition said. So wool became a liability. And that's part of what brought the hair sheep, to the forefront. And we'll come back to wool and hair sheep here in a little bit, but those are the selections that we make. And then largely when we think about goats, think about the Spanish meat goat particularly, and like Nubian dairy goats. They're desert animals. Their adaptation is really hot, dry environments, or at least temperate, dry environments. Cold and wet is not good for, desert-derived goats at all. And I know some people in, Missouri, Kentucky, Virginia, who, really failed miserably in the goat business because they just couldn't stand all of that moisture, all that wet weather, particularly when it turned cold. Now there are other types of goats, but the meat goats mostly are better suited for a warmer, drier climate. So sometimes it's just too wet and coldy. So coming back to the wolves, one of the very popular sheep breeds for handcraft, spinners and weavers, is the Icelandic sheep. And I mean, they have this immensely long, thick, very woolly fleece. One of the common complaints or challenges to raising sheep and goats is parasites. There's the general perception, they are just vacuum cleaners for sucking up every possible parasite that's in the field. And that's not necessarily true, but within, all of these wool breeds of sheep, there are some breeds that actually have good resistance, natural resistance, genetic resistance to parasites. And Romney sheep from England, because they come from the coastal marshes kind of area, that's an example. It's a high quality handcrafting fleece, and they're resistant to foot rot, they're parasite tolerant. So if you are in a climate where those are threats to your enterprise, put some planning and some thought into what animals you choose to get. And then from a hot or a warm, wet environment, St. Croix, which is a hair sheep breed, they have natural foot rot and parasite resistance. So again, if you're going to go down the hair sheep path, there are breeds that will work in this environment better than some of those other breeds will do. And then we come to birds. Birds, if we think in the wild world and we think about indicators of overall ecosystem health, diverse and abundant bird populations are generally an indicator that everything is working pretty well in that particular climate, because we have largely wiped out birds, wild birds in most of the country. To get the services that birds provide in the ecosystem, this is why we bring pasture poultry into the the farming operation. What those chickens are basically doing out there is they're scratching through all the manure piles and the sheep and goat pellets, and they're picking out fly eggs, worm eggs, the larvae of these. And so they can do a pretty good job of sterilizing the pasture. So broilers are very often called the gateway meat. If a vegetarian is going to start eating meat again, usually it's chicken. If someone has meat to sell at a farmer's market, usually the first thing that you sell is chicken. And so, and if you don't know, yeah, chicken is the most widely consumed meat in the U.S. We eat more chicken than we eat beef. There's different production models for doing broilers. These are all what would be considered chicken tractors. This one here, this is, the classic. This is actually on Polysace Farms. This is on Salatin's place. These wood frame, tin covered chicken tractors. That's Salatin started doing these in the 1970s, and a lot of people are still building chicken tractors based just exactly how Joel Salatin does it. Well, there's other ways of doing it. These ones here are PVC hoop houses, mini hoop houses, and so they have like a tarpaulin cover on it. These are called, poultry yurts. They're a welded rebar frame, again with a tarp material, custom made, so it fits snugly on that frame type deal. Now, in a windy condition, all right, this is PVC and a tarp. How well do you think that stays in that place on the field? Unless you anchor it down, these things will blow away and go tumbling across the field. They're very lightweight, so they're easy to move, but you got to anchor them to the ground. These chicken yurts with the rebar frame, they're heavy enough that usually you want to have two people there to move them rather than just one person, which moves either a Salatin tractor or these here. So there was a fella who he had apprenticed at Salatin's, Grady Phelan from Oklahoma was his name. And he went to work on a place in Texas, Cobb Creek Farm. Now, our son Ian ran the cattle operation at Cobb Creek, and Grady came there to do their pasture poultry program. And because he had been at Salatin's, he had tried to use the Salatin chicken tractor model in southern Oklahoma on the home farm, and he found out they were just toaster ovens. I mean, you broil the broilers in those things in Oklahoma heat. So he designed an open side, and it's just chicken wire, but a much lighter framework, higher roof so that there's air movement through it so the chickens wouldn't burn up. And that is called a Texas high rise. So there's variations on the theme from the chicken tractor, but this is the way most smaller operations are going to be raising pasture poultry. If you want to produce at a larger scale, you go to these bigger hoop houses. And I believe these were 30 by 48. On Cobb Creek, they ran 12 of these 600 bird units. And they would do like 5 production cycles a year. And the labor efficiency and they still move them every day, but you move them with a piece of equipment, and a big side by side could move them, but really if you had a 30 to 40 horse tractor, that's what you'd probably go out there and move them. And there's no flooring in there; they're just on the ground. And they in one production cycle, which was typically 8 weeks in the hoop house, and they're moving them every day. So that's 56 moves out of 600 birds. They'd kill fewer than 5 being run over when they were moving the houses. The chickens figured out pretty quick. If the house starts moving, you better start moving. So they went that way. I had the same concern is, how do you not smash all the chickens? Yeah. And the answer is, well, the chickens figured it out pretty quick. On the subject of dumb chickens, just another one of those useless trivia. Anybody know what the, I don't know if I want to call them relationship psychologists or whatever, but people who study such things, how many, the average human being, like, us in there, well, I guess we're all above average, but if you consider the average human being, how many people can a person know on what we would consider a first name basis? So that you see that person and you know their name and where they fit into your, circle of acquaintances. On average, how many people do we know on a first name basis? It's about 250. That's the average person, can know 250 people, and kind of like where I know them from. You know how many individuals a chicken can know and recognize that bird, where it fits in the social structure of the flock?
You're talking about the pack order then?
Yeah, the peck order. How many chickens is in the typical chicken's peck order?
20.
I got a 20.
100.
I got 100. All of them? Did somebody say all of them? 600.
Wow.
And they all look the same. Yeah, yeah. But 600 is what an individual chicken can recognize how they fit into the flock and what the pecking order is. And then I say, yeah, but what else does a chicken have to think about? And so a chicken has to think about surviving. And, there's 599 other chickens in that bird who that chicken is just motivated. I'm going to live longer than they are. And so they move. So, but I was shocked when I learned that, because the way we look at them is every one of them looks exactly the same. How can you know who they are? But to the chickens, they all are different. What I want to point out here, you can see the type of vegetation that's out there before the hoop houses are going across there. So the reason concrete got into pasture poultry was because so much of their land was just so bad, and they wanted to, add fertility, build soil there. And you can see after the house passes over it, there's not much of anything left. But 2 weeks later, that's as thick as a lawn and green coming up. And it just, will continue to get better. But a big part of why people bring broilers onto a farm is building soil. Now, even though we call these pasture broilers, usually 80+% of their diet is coming from grain. All right, but and it is that 80% grain in the diet and all, the minerals that are getting excreted through that is what is building the fertility. Now, if we are looking at layers serve a different purpose on the farm. The layers are there to clean the parasites out of the manure. And so with layers, there are some outfits that do it with no grain. If you do it with no grain, your percent of hens producing, an egg each day, it's going to be lower, but you are going to have a much darker colored yolk. And those yolks are going to be very mineral rich and nutritious. And so some people give up the higher level of productivity to get that specialty product. And those are the kind of eggs that in, LA area right now are selling for $24 a dozen, $2 an egg for a true grain-free, free-range egg. $24 a dozen. All right, now, typically 20 to 40% of the diet of layers on pasture is going to be coming from grain. And biggest reason for that is you significantly increase the percent of hens laying eggs every day. Some of these zero grain outfits, only about 40% of the hens produce an egg each day. 80+% egging rate is common when you get into the grain supplementation. What is the appropriate stocking rate for layers on pasture? If your objective is to get all the manure processed, 2 hens per animal unit. That's the typical stocking rate. So if you have cows, you'd figure 2 hens per cow. If you're running sheep, you're probably figuring, 2 hens per 5 ewes, 6 ewes, something like that. But there is a pretty well-defined stocking rate of hens to cattle for what it takes to get all the manure processed and cleaned out. A real popular, and these movable hen houses, those are usually called egg mobiles. And real popular egg mobile size, if you're doing this at scale, is 200 birds. And so this modified stock trailer that's set up as a 200 bird unit, Conestoga wagon back there, 200 bird unit. And there is a distance away from the hen house that hens will range over the course of the day and ground that they will cover. And so if you had 200 cows in a herd, you would want to have 400 layers following them. And if you had all 400 layers, if you made a bigger egg mobile and all 400 would go into that bigger egg mobile, they'd still only range about 150, maybe 200 yards away from the hen house. And for your 200 head of cows, the paddock that you're giving them is probably bigger than what, the hens from one hen house will do. So you really size the number of egg mobiles to the amount of area that each day your cattle are going to be using to ensure that you have, and it might take 3 hen houses out there to ensure that they're covering the entire area where the cattle have grazed that day. It isn't, just a simple matter of, well, I'm going to put some chickens in a house on wheels and park it out there and they'll take care of my manure problem. Or your parasite problem, they'll only take care of your fly and parasite problem if those chickens are really distributed and working all of the land that the cattle are using. Turkeys are, because, most Americans, we eat turkey once a year, unless it's, it's just lunch meat or something. But to make a turkey, get an adult turkey and cook the whole turkey, for the most part, we do that once a year. So people raising turkeys are basically just looking at that Thanksgiving market. Turkeys are very, very good at larger insects. Grasshoppers, turkeys are one of the best grasshopper management tools there is. Unfortunately, if you got a 200-acre farm that's overrun with grasshoppers, it's really hard to take 50 turkeys and make much of an impact on 200 acres. But where the turkeys are, grasshoppers are one of their favorite feeds, and they will eat a lot of grasshoppers. Um, you look at wild turkeys and you say, well, they grow out fine in a year. They're a nice sized bird. Why do my turkeys have to have grain? You realize how much grain wild turkeys actually eat from the edge of the field and coming up to the grain bins and all that? There are places, where there are wild turkeys who don't get any grain supplementation, but Missouri and eastern Kansas probably are not those kind of areas. Um, I'm not going to, I've never raised turkeys, so I've got not much more to say about it now. Um, some people raise ducks on pasture, for meat, and guineas. There's a lot of other birds that come that occasionally you'll see people raising out on pasture. But broilers and layers are by far the two biggest pasture poultry enterprises. Let's think more about parasites now. And this is a just general principle. The higher the utilization rate of the pasture, the greater the risk of getting infected with parasites are. And we'll look at why that's the case. But whatever grazing animal we're talking about, this is true for all of them. As you push them to higher and higher levels of utilization, parasite risk goes up. And this is the basic reason why. If you look at where parasites are distributed in the plant canopy, most worm larvae are under 2 inches. There's very few between 2 and 4 inches, and you get beyond 4 inches, and there's rarely any infective larva that's in that pasture. The only parasite that I can think of that doesn't follow this pattern is liver flukes, because liver flukes they have the snail as the alternate host, and it's the snail up on taller parts of the plant getting grazed. That's how your livestock get liver flukes. But all the stomach worms, the larvae do not climb up to the tip of the leaf and jump into the sheep's mouth. They've got to be consumed by grazing down in this layer here. So this is why, as you go to higher and higher utilization rates, the risk of parasite infection goes up, because you're making your animals graze down to this level here. So the biggest anti-parasite strategy for sheep and goats, in my view, is don't make them eat off the ground. If they're eating down to ground level, they are going to have parasites. So just don't do it. And then this is another one, and this is a vice versa situation. Most of the parasites that are chronic to sheep and goats, cattle are dead end hosts. Cattle can eat those, and they're nothing more than a protein supplement going into the rumen. And most cattle parasites, sheep and goats can consume those, and they just get digested. They don't infect the animal. The one exception that I can think of is tapeworms. Whether we're talking about dog, people, goats, sheep, cattle, we all basically have the same tapeworms. So that is one parasite that doesn't dead end in alternate species. The first stage, those will start hatching out, and it depends on temperature and moisture, stuff like that. But it can be as short as 3 to 5 days, but more typically it's a couple of weeks. The larvae develop in the second stage, larvae develop, and then the third stage where they hatch out, where they can, come get back into the grass and be ready to infect animals again. So that cycle, it's 14 to 28 days, depending on the particular worm species. Usually we talk about 21 days, they're ready to reinfect host animals. And this bottom line, your grazing period should never be long enough to allow reinfection within the same grazing period. because the grazing periods were so long that it just about guaranteed that the animals would reinfect themselves because they were staying too long on that pasture. So once we get down to splitting hairs about whether 1 day or 3 days is better, well, 7 days, that's some people, because they have a job in town, the only time they're ever out to the farm is on the weekend. And so they rotate once a week. And as I said, that's a world better than never rotating. Even with a week-long grazing period, for the internal parasites, you're not going to get reinfected in a week-long grazing period. So as long as we're operating at something less than 7 days, reinfection within the same grazing period isn't going to happen. Recovery periods, if you're rotating fairly quickly, I mean, if the hatch process takes, 21 days approximately, and you're coming back to that pasture at 28 days or 35 days, you will be coming back just, as those larvae are really out there abundantly. And this is where this idea or principle of alternate livestock species being a dead host becomes important. So if you're running on these short recovery periods, you pretty well want to make the next grazing event be with a different class of livestock that isn't going to take up those parasites. If you're operating pretty consistently at longer than 40-day recovery periods, your risk of reinfection goes down. And I think this next slide is going to help us understand that. So, warm and sunny is good for the livestock, bad for the parasites. Because if it's warm and sunny, those larvae, which are high moisture slime basically, are going to dry out and they're going to be killed. Cool, moist weather, on the other hand, that if you have weather like that, your infective larva stage is going to persist much longer in that pasture. Clear and sunny kills parasites. Cloudy and wet keeps them alive. Now, if you know that, or have reason to believe that a pasture is carrying a lot of larvae in it, and you said, okay, well, I can graze it with the cattle rather than the sheep, that might be a time when you actually want to graze over aggressively. All the time I'm telling you, you need to leave residuals, at this, 4 to 6 inch range. But if you have a sheep pasture that you have reason to believe has a lot of parasites in it and you can graze it with cattle, take it down to 2 inches and let that sunlight get to the base of the plants where those larvae are living. And if you get sunlight, intense sunlight on the base of the plants, you basically sterilize. Bob Corwin was the veterinary parasitologist we did a lot of research with in Missouri. And, he was a strong advocate of let the sun shine into the bottom of your pasture because that'll kill every worm out there. And so his management recommendations were often contradictory to ours because we're telling people to leave grass behind and he's telling people to take it down to bare ground because that'll kill every worm. So you find the happy place in between. Yes.
What about fire?
Fire will definitely clean them out because they have to have moist plant material to persist in there. And so fire will pretty well clean parasites entirely out of an area. Other than the ostritation, because ostritation will go into the ground and persist in the ground. Managing for performance specifically, tying back to, we've talked about higher utilization rates encourage parasites. Higher utilization rates also depress individual animal performance. So all of this energy aspect that we're talking about, how do we get the appropriate level of energy into the livestock, really ties to the severity of grazing. How much of that standing forage are we asking the animals to use in this grazing event? That is what's going to control what their level of energy intake is going to be. So basically, lower utilization where we're leaving ample residual behind is going to give us higher individual performance. A leader follower grazing management presumes that you're going to have at least two herds and that there is nutritional requirements different between those two herds. Generally, we're thinking about a group of animals that has a high nutritional demand and a group that has a lower demand. And we put the high nutrition demanding group into the pasture first. We ask them to utilize a certain portion of it. They move on, and then we come in with a second group of animals that has a lower nutritional requirement, and they utilize the remaining amount of the available feed. It's important that we're leaving appropriate post-grazing residual after the second group, comes through. We don't want to have the first group take off a big share and then make the second group over or more severely graze the pasture than what we really want to do. And this illustration here would be the lactating cows going through first and then replacement heifers coming through behind. Make this worth doing, there does have to be a meaningful difference in the nutritional needs of the two groups. In Missouri, I think this would have been in the early 90s, we looked at running yearling stockers in with cow-calf or doing the yearlings as a leader group, cows as a follower group. And we gained about 0.3 of a pound more per day when the stockers went through as a leader group. And so you say, well, if you do that for 100 days, 0.3 of a pound a day, that's 30 pounds more you have put on the animal. And then it becomes a question, is it worth it to do that? Custom grazing, right now, if you're doing it by weight, probably 70 to 80 cents a pound of gain is the pay rate. So 30 pounds times 80 cents is $24. If you have 50 head of those yearlings, that is $700 additional dollars. But if it were 500 head and you did that for 100 days, then we're looking at $7,000 extra because you did the leader follower. So there's definitely a scale of operation reaction here that you need to consider. Okay, because we ran sheep and cattle for 9 years in Missouri, we had sheep and cattle. And, people ask me, oh, did you just graze them together? Or did the sheep go in front? Did the sheep come behind? And the answer is yes, we did all of those. And it depends on what is the nutritional difference in the herds or flocks. What is the vegetation management objective that you've got going on? And very commonly, sheep follow behind a cattle herd because we're having the cattle graze the good grass out of this pasture. And we know we have broadleaf weeds, forbs out there that the cattle won't eat. And so if the cattle go through, harvest the grass, move on, we come in with the sheep and they have that preference for grazing forbs. And so they'll come behind the cattle and mostly be impacting. Now, one of the custom grazing enterprises that we did was we grazed dry fall calving cows from middle of April to the beginning of August for, another farmer. And our ewe flock were spring lambing ewes on grass. And so in that situation, because the ewes and lambs have the higher nutritional requirement and dry fall calving cows had very low requirement, the sheep would go through the pasture first, followed by the dry fall cows. And so that's a combination that we used that worked well. Our own cow herd was spring calving. They calved on green grass. The sheep calved on green grass. They both had, cattle and sheep had essentially the same nutritional requirements. So that might be a situation where we just put all the ewes and lambs, cows and calves together and just grazed them as a single herd, because there was no distinct advantage of one group going ahead or behind of the other. So I have run sheep and cattle in all of those configurations, grazing together, sheep in front, cattle behind, cattle in front, sheep behind. So it's another one of those, it depends type answers, but there's reasons. You just want to have reasons for doing things. Talking about very high energy requirement, using nannies with twins and triplets. They would be a leader group, and beef replacement heifers following them. And again, it's just sorting out based on what their relative energy demand is. So there's, old MacDonald is the guy who had all of these things together. And I don't know how the words of the song go anymore other than old MacDonald had a farm, but did he have a plan? And that's just what I want to emphasize, that if you are going to get into mixed species grazing, you need to have a plan. There's a lot of moving pieces that you're starting to manage, and everything from the infrastructure, the pasture type, the parasite consideration, the nutritional needs of the animals. You got to fit all of those pieces together.